Hi, everybody. Hey, it's Mr. Forster. This is going to be kind of an overview for Chapter 5. It primarily deals with antennas. Okay, so let me go ahead and share the screen here for a moment. There we go. And there we go, Chapter 5. Let's open up the little PowerPoint. Bingo. Okay, so what are some things that we talk about antennas? You know, I mean, the antennas themselves or whatever, we're talking about some basic concepts about how we take that that antenna, its power, its frequency, okay, and then how we convert that into a signal, a wave, a radio wave to go from point A to point B. So we're talking about trying to have an antenna on one building talking to an antenna on another building, okay, or from one device to an antenna, something like that. So some of the base terminology we need to kind of take a look at would be radio frequency lobes, okay? So lobes is kind of that shape, you know, of the antenna signal as it goes out, that energy that's emitted from that antenna. And there are different types of antennas, and therefore we have different shapes, okay? So some basic things can be like a main lobes or perhaps some side lobes or something like that. And what we're talking about is, you know, where we're going to try to acquire the signal from that antenna, okay, or where it's going to broadcast out or whatever, okay. Then we have what are called beam widths, okay. So we're going to measure that measurement of the radio frequency. When we're measuring frequencies on radios and stuff, we never want to measure at, you know, 0 power, obviously nothing, okay, or 100% power. So we're going to measure it at kind of a halfway point, kind of like taking on the average, okay. And so that half power, whatever, we can measure both the horizontal beam and the vertical beam. And we're going to talk about horizontal and vertical in a second here as we go through. So that's the beam width, okay, kind of like. And then we have what are called antenna gains, okay? The antenna gains and stuff provides that increase of radio frequency over an area, okay? So it's, you know, it's like how strong is that gain? Okay, we have the passive gain. So I put an antenna, you know, when I was a kid, we had a television set, and then we had to add the antenna, called some, they look like rabbit ears or whatever, okay, or bow tie antennas. That was a passive gain kind of antenna, okay? It was measured based upon whatever it could capture in that signal, and then that was it, as opposed to a passive gain stuff, as opposed to an active gain, where we used powered antennas. Okay, so we can use a source of power, an external source, to enhance the antenna, enhance the radio frequency, and perhaps get a stronger signal that covers a bigger distance. Okay, all right. What else is there? Polarization. You know, are we talking about? We're looking at the two antennas. Are they facing each other this way here on a horizontal beam, whatever, okay, or are they facing each other this way from top to bottom, whatever, in a vertical beam? So polarization is something that we should think about and stuff in terms of the types of antennas and how we're communicating between these antennas, okay? Then we have the omnidirectional antennas. Now we start into the different types of antennas, okay? So it's very common, omnidirectional antennas, okay? If you really kind of look at this picture, which is kind of a funny looking donut or something like that with a hole, we're talking about how the signal radiates out, and that's above and below and the side. It goes in all these different omnidirectional, 360 degrees basically from that point in the center, okay? So the weakest point is obviously right close to the antenna, okay? And then it radiates out in all the different directions, okay? That's an omnidirectional antenna. Now, here's a way they're looking at, a way to give you kind of a visual here. The horizontal antenna, or the horizontal azimuth, whatever stuff, is when we're like looking down on the antenna. So like a bird's eye view, if you were to look down and say, okay, how does this how do the lobes, or how does this cover an area? Well, if it's omnidirectional, it's 360 degrees, right? You're looking down, it's omni, 360 degrees, turn all the way around, 360 degrees, looking from above. Now, when you're looking at it from the side, from a vertical standpoint, okay, what we're seeing is how high or how low it goes, okay? What angles does it cover, okay, on that spectrum, okay? So again, bird's eye view is the horizontal, looking down, okay, looking down, and then horizontal is looking at from the side, so we can see it above or below that horizontal, or excuse me, that vertical point, okay. So horizontal bird's eye view, vertical side view, okay. All right, omnidirectional. Perfect. Okay. Semi-directional antennas. There's different types of semi-directional antennas. There are patch antennas. You may have seen some of these are panels, things that look like this, that you may be somebody stuck up on a wall or on a window trying to get something out. A Yagi antenna and stuff. You don't see those as often. Okay. Or hey, this one here, you know, we'll be talking about a sector antenna. That looks like something that you would see on a cell tower. Okay. So, and matter of fact, you wouldn't see one, you'd probably see a bunch of them radiate out in a circle if they wanted to cover all 360 degrees. These are semi-directional, not omnidirectional, semi-directional. Okay. And again, when we look at the semi-directional, makes sense. Here's the bird's eye view. So looking down, it's definitely looking at a particular direction, looking towards something, wherever. That's the semi-directional. It covers a little bit around the base, okay? But most of it is focused in that particular direction of which way it's pointed. That's the horizontal bird's eye view, okay? When you look at it from the side view and stuff, doesn't go as high, right? Remember that other one, the omnidirectional stuff, you know, went up 60 degrees or whatever and stuff. This one here is less than like 30 degrees, right? So it's a semi-directional, it's a more narrowed focused directional antenna, okay? Then we have highly directional antennas. You know, some of these things look like satellite dishes or microwave dishes or whatever, okay? Usually used for very long distances, you know, to be able to do that. For years and stuff, I think we're still using it, if I remember correctly. We would communicate on the top of the health science building, okay, which is over on the east side of the railroad tracks, to our police academy and our fire academy, which is on the other side of Blackstone behind the stadium. Okay, and the best way for us to communicate was to have two directional devices. Okay, so we can talk to each other. And we were using at that time microwave dishes because that was kind of the norm, you know, 40 years ago, whatever. Okay, nowadays and stuff, we can use alternative methods and we can pay through, you know, the internet service provider, right? And then have our control for our encryption for student information or employee information, someone. Okay, and we can basically tunnel right through the internet to go from point A to point B. But hey, what was on the roofs actually worked. We just needed to make sure that everything was nice and clear. It could have been semi-directional, but this was at a time where the most common things were out there were directional microwave antennas. Okay, again, they're highly directional, you know, focused from point A to point B. That's what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, what are some factors in installing the antennas? Okay, so certainly, you know, the effects of the Earth and the curvature of the Earth can be an issue if you're talking about signals, you know, that are long distances. Okay, omnidirectionals, again, you know, only go so far, but they cover a nice shape. Okay, semi-directional, very targeted, but again, only go a certain distance, and then high directional, even more targeted, but much longer distance. Okay. Little side note story here. Okay. You know, I was talking to my dad one time who served in the Navy during the Korean War, and he was, you know, working communications. He was a quartermaster and a navigator. And I was just happened to talk about networks, and I was talking about cloud communications. And he says, "Oh, Mark, gosh, we were doing cloud communications back in the 50s. Like, okay. And I'm trying to think about, it's like networks back in the 50s. How was he doing cloud communications? He said, well, okay, it's a simple concept here. You have the Earth, which is a round sphere, and then you would have a ship, which would be on this side of the Earth, but it was line of sight signals. Okay, so a ship could only communicate if something was on the same curvature at that same angle. And if the ship was on, another ship was on the other side, right, the two ships couldn't cover itself, right, because the Earth is round. So you have a round Earth, and you have the signals that cross and they miss each other. Okay, so if they're on the same planes, they can communicate. So that line of sight signal isn't very far, okay, about 10 miles or so, whatever, because as it starts to curve, the Earth starts to curve and the ship goes over the horizon and curves, it's no longer in the line of sight. Okay, so I said, well, okay, Dad, that's kind of cool. Great, that makes sense to me. What does that mean with cloud communications? He said, well, we were fine when we were on the same angle, right? Okay, the same tangent on the Earth. But once a ship went over the horizon, or a ship was coming from the opposite horizon, we were kind of like screwed. So how did you communicate? He says, well, if we were lucky, there were clouds in the sky. And I go, okay, so what did you do with the clouds? He said, well, we would take our signal lights and we would flash them up into the clouds, okay, that were above the Earth at that point, and we would literally light up the clouds, literally strobe the clouds. And so if we were going to send SOS, we would make the clouds light up, right? Dash, 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 dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, 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 SOS. The clouds would literally light up. And because of the angle, because of the curvature of the Earth, this ship could not see this ship. But if they lit up the cloud in the middle, they could actually communicate back and forth. Go figure, 1950s cloud communications. Anyway, wireless communications using signals. Anyway, back to the subject here. Okay, multipath antennas and stuff. And then what are some things that common things that could also address this? It's not a really complicated chapter. Things like lightning strikes. You know, I mean, these things are on metal poles and stuff, right? You know, so everything's got to be grounded. We got to think about wind, right? And what that could play in that world and stuff in terms of placing your antennas, especially when it's a smaller, you know, a company or at home, or, you know, maybe your parents have, you know, 5 acres or something like that. And you got a barn way in the back, and then you got the main house, or whatever, and then you got the shed, and you're trying to communicate to them and stuff. So these are things that we have to take into consideration is, where are we placing these antennas? Okay, so are they grounded? Are they going to be up on a pole, right? That, hey, it could be a lightning strike or whatever and stuff. Or are they going to be mounted on the side of a wall? Okay, we have a lot of those here at City College where they're wall mounted. Are they going to be ceiling mounted, like we have, some of them we have in the classrooms, but also some of them we have in hallways. Okay, so we have different types of mounting locations. We need to do that assessment later on. We'll talk about assessments in this book as well. Okay. And then again, we want to make sure that we can have as clear a line of sight as possible, visual, okay, are the radio frequencies line of sight communications. I talked about that one. But there's one other last term here, the Fresnel zone, kind of funny word, but Fresnel zone, which is that area that what happens is that you have these signal, but there's an area above and below kind of surrounding it. It's like this outer ring here, okay? And the things that could start to inhibit or interfere with the radio frequency, okay? Or that line of sight. And hey, it's perfect, they got these trees. What happens when these trees start to grow up? They start entering the Fresnel zone, then they start entering the actual line of sight, and they start interfering with our antenna communications, okay? So we have to think about what is happening in between, you know, our buildings and stuff like that. If we were covering buildings, you know, in a downtown area, and there's a new project in the middle between our buildings, somebody bought the building in between, whatever, and then they made it, you know, 5 stories instead of 2 stories, guess what? We may not be able to use line of sight or radio frequency anymore, because we have our radio frequency line of sight that's going to be interfered. Okay, so the Fresnel zone is that part that we start to think about is what could inhibit or start to interfere with our radio frequencies. Anyway, I hope this helps, gives you kind of an overview. I know it's really geeky about one topic on antennas, but it's kind of interesting in some ways. Kind of makes you think about the different types of antennas that are out there. All right, let me go ahead and stop this share. There we go. And I'll stop the recording. Enjoy the rest of your day.